and welcome to Enquire to Choir. My name is Eva and I'm here to help you, fellow choir people. This video could be a controversial one, so I wanted to start this discussion by saying that this question came from you. And I think it's a fair question because we have been talking about everything on this channel, assuming that every choir in the world has the capacity and the circumstances that can achieve a good choir sound. However, in the past few months, I have gotten a question several times from several different people about what to do when your choir sounds really bad, or the sound is really off, or the singers are really bad, and you as the choir director are standing in front of them completely lost without any motivation to continue. I will not go into discussion whether your choir sound is really that bad, but I want to be really real about the fact that some of us, including me, have been in a situation where the choir sounds really bad, and so bad that it's almost uncomfortable. Not to mention, it is really not easy handling that kind of a choir, and I would argue that it's more common than we think. It is really easy to discuss details and how to perfect certain things when you already have a good base, when the choir sound is a sound. And it's really easy to talk about multi-voice parts when you have good voice parts or enough singers in the choir. I had been in such a situation when you just have to take a really big step back and work on some fundamental things that are so fundamental that your ego takes a hit. And of course, we always think that it's something about us as the choir director. And sometimes it is, let's be fair. Sometimes we have the wrong approach, but it is really real that singers out there don't always make for a good choir. So I think it's worth discussing it. I think it's worth to start a real discussion and be really real when it comes to this, especially if you're asking advice. I think the main point of this channel is to really answer the real questions. So without further ado, because I said the word real so many times, let's start with the video, and I hope you find it really helpful. First of all, if your choir sounds bad or not good, that is really unmotivating. It is difficult to have rehearsals and especially performances when you know that your choir doesn't sound good. And the problem with the choir sound is people don't have to know anything about music. They don't have to have any skills when it comes to their ears. But a bad choir sound, out of tune choir sound, everybody recognizes. We as the choir directors and the public often go down the road of thinking the problem is with the singers, the solution is to find new choir singers. Most probably that is true. I will not argue with that. Sometimes it is really about the singers. But first of all, it is really not easy to get new singers. We discussed this in this video. Plus, let's be real, if your choir sounds not good, you will not get new singers because people want to join a choir when it is a good choir. And if your choir is not sounding that good, then the chance of you getting new choir members is slim. And I know it's an awful thing to say, but it's true. I don't think it's helpful of me to sugarcoat anything. So if you're hoping for new choir singers to solve your problem, I agree. They would probably solve the problem, at least a little bit. But often, if not always, you have to work with the people you already have in the choir because they're there. They are the choir, and you will have to wait for certain things to happen in order to get new singers. And that's objectively a problem. So the question is, what can you do as the choir director to improve them, to improve the sound that is really not working? The first thing I would say is that we have to be really honest with ourselves about what our choir sounds like. I know I had that problem in the past, and I mentioned that in the video about the mistakes I made as a choir director. If your choir sound is really not working, then when you start to think about it, it turns out that it's probably even more problematic than you thought at first. And that is something that you have to take your ego in count. You have to talk with yourself, because the worst part of handling that situation is letting go of your ego and admitting to yourself that if you want to tackle that, if you want to work on that, if you decided that you're going to stay and you will not leave the choir, you have to realize that for a while you will be in front of a choir that sounds not good and even worse. Because once you start tackling that problem, for a while it will get worse and then it will get better. Because if a choir doesn't sound good enough or good at all, you're not in an easy position, but the only way is to go through it. You will be stuck in that same situation all the time. Things will not improve without your intervention. And if you want to leave, if you don't want to have that kind of a choir, then you're free to leave, but take it as an opportunity to learn really something invaluable. Because if you can handle a choir that doesn't sound good and then make them sound acceptable, then further down the line you will only get more capable. Okay, so let's go through the things that you can do. The first thing I would do, and I had done, is to downsize the repertoire, to go simpler. First of all, we all have this notion that a choir is a certain type of a choir. So if you have female and male chorus in there, it has to be soprano, alto, tenor, bass at least. You have to sing these compositions that are of certain difficulty, and you have to sing the arrangements that all the other choirs sing, because that's the tradition. Especially if you're not the first choir director of that choir, you have to sing the previous songs as well, and the arrangement the previous choir director learned with the choir. There are several versions of the same song. If your choir doesn't sound good or is not capable of singing a certain score, even though you have practiced it a million times, that's a sign to go a bit simpler. I understand you don't always have the luxury to do that, but if you have a certain amount of flexibility with this, go simpler. Downsize the difficulty, because sometimes that's the only way. In order to get to the more difficult scores, you have to tackle on simpler ones. That's the first thing I had done. I realized that the score, the arrangement, it will not happen. You get to a certain point when you realize that it's just, no matter how much you practice, no matter how many solutions you come up with, no matter how many rehearsals, additional rehearsals and additional practices you schedule, it's not moving. And that's a sign of they can't sing that now. They're not ready. So I go simpler. And the best thing about that is if you try simpler songs, simpler arrangements, they will feel more capable, and the motivation they have will go up. They will be more motivated when they feel they actually can do something. Because if they're stuck with certain songs and certain arrangements and a certain difficulty, and they're not able to pass that threshold, then they start to feel really unmotivated, because they feel there's no use. But if you go simpler, the parts are simpler, the arrangement is simpler, so it's a benefit. It's not something that is a permanent state. And once you tackle on the simpler things, then you can go to the arrangements you wanted to sing in the first hand. The second thing is a bit controversial, but I would strongly advise you to do this. You can downsize the number of voice parts. Hear me out. I know if you have soprano, alto, tenor, bass, it sounds really controversial to just have the first voice and the second voice. And I'm not saying that you have to let go of certain singers, but for example, I got a question here from a dear subscriber, hi, and the question was, what do I do if I have terrible baritones and basses? The answer to that question would be connect them into one voice. If you have tenors and basses and they're not good on their own, they're weak on their own, then I would make a single voice part that consists of all the tenors and basses, and I would treat it as one voice. How can I do that? Well, I find the scores where there's only one male chorus voice part, and the range is something a bass and a tenor can handle, so somewhere in the middle. And then I have more singers singing the same melody, and they learn how to be better because they are practicing a simpler line. They're not doing two voice parts, they're singing one voice part, and they're tackling it, and they're getting used to the sound, and they're getting to be better because they're, again, doing something simpler. The same is with sopranos and altos. You don't always have to have sopranos and altos. You can connect them into one voice, and you can arrange that the vocal range of their lines is somewhere in the middle that can easily be handled by a soprano and by an alto. That makes for a better choir sound because the mistakes and the uneasy things about the choir sound are worked on better this way. A lot of the times I went from 4 voice part choir to 2 voice part choir, and I will be very honest, to 1 voice part choir. The male and the female choruses sang the same melody in their respective range, and that's the way I sometimes had to do it because that was the only way. I know there is a certain convention when it comes to what a choir is, and it's really difficult to explain that you may have 30 singers, but you're only singing 2 voice parts. And that's something you as a choir director would have to explain, but there is a logic behind it. Let's first work on 2 voice parts, and then we will go to 4 voice parts. I hope that makes sense. Of course, all of this can happen if you have the luxury of time to work on that. Sometimes you can do that immediately. You can just bring a simpler song to the next rehearsal and say, we're singing this, forget about this, let's try this. But if you have the luxury, I strongly advise you take the time, really cancel performances, and just be really honest with your choir and say, listen, we have to take some time to improve the choir sound. It is not working and you can hear it. We want to become better and we have to take the time to become better. So let's take a month without any performances or without doing anything for a performance, without any plan for a performance. Let's just take the time and practice for a month, for 2 months, for 6 months. Let's work on the improvement we want to see, because you really have to take the time. I am a big proponent of choir performances. I think they're very important, but you don't want to have a performance if you're not feeling really okay with the fact that you're performing. As I said, you can schedule additional rehearsals, practices, you can work separately, you can work with different teachers, and you can work on your choir directing, but sometimes you really need to go back to basics and try to work on the basics. And for that, you need time. For one of my choirs, it took 5 years to get a good choir sound. And the amount of bad performances I had to stand in front of was terrible. And I know that many people behind my back said things about my choir, but eventually I proved them wrong because I knew what my choir is working on. And I knew that at a certain point, the results will show. Communicate with your choir, be very honest with them, and say that this is your idea. And if you have their trust and their respect, I think they will acknowledge that that could be a good way to go. The next thing I want to talk about is you can practice in a better way. Again, practicing more doesn't mean you're practicing at all. You can repeat a song from the beginning to the end 300 times and not improve a single thing because you're not solving the problem that is actually with that particular score. We have certain videos here on the channel. For example, why is your choir not in tempo? And in that video, I discuss that it's not about not being in tempo. Not being in tempo is a repercussion of something else that is going on. The same is with being out of tune. Some things are just repercussions of other problems, other issues. And if you keep repeating the same song without going into much detail, without tackling certain transitions or certain chords or certain places, certain bars, certain difficult rhythms, you will always have the same result. If you want to try to solve the problem, you have to do a different thing. So try to analyze that score you have seen 100 times and try to think of all of the things that can be a problem for your choir, because sometimes it turns out that the most basic problem is the biggest problem. Something you really don't think of because you consider it to be such a trivial issue that it's not important, and in most cases that issue is the main problem. So stop repeating the same song from the beginning to the end. That is not practicing. Practicing is a different thing. It's taking on a really small moment from the score and working on it. And then trying, after several places like that and several improvements of certain places, then you connect the whole score. Practice smarter, change your point of view when it comes to what practicing is, and try it like that. And finally, the biggest advice, and I will do a video about that next week. Write choral arrangements made for your choir and write them smarter. If you have any ability of writing an arrangement for your choir, that could benefit you so much. We talk a lot about how to choose choir repertoire for your choir, and I keep repeating that that is one of the best things you can do. It is a battle half won if you choose good choir repertoire, appropriate choir repertoire for your choir's skills. But if you choose a choir arrangement that works for your choir the best, that's even better. If you have any skills to write an arrangement for your choir because you know what your choir is capable of, then that's the way to go. I realized that when I write an arrangement particularly for my choir, as their choir director who knows them the best, who knows what the best tones for them are, how high they can go, how low they can go comfortably, the things they're capable of in general. When I write the arrangement particularly for them and for the state they are in, that gives them so much. That gives them a big opportunity to be better. How to do that, we will analyze that in the next video. But for now, realize that you can go that way, even if you have never written a choral arrangement before. If your choir is really not sounding the way you want them to sound, try to write it. Try to write it. You can surprise yourself. I didn't even start writing arrangements because I wanted to write them. It was from necessity. If you feel comfortable with that, it's a skill, it can be practiced, but it is a really rational thing to think that if you have a choir that is really not comfortable singing regular choir scores, then you can take the same song, the same melodies, and try to arrange them in a way that can make them feel more comfortable. It is really difficult to talk about a choir being bad because people are trying and they're putting their best foot forward and things are not happening, and now I'm making a video about how to work with that kind of a choir. But that's the reason why we're here. I know from experience that I was taught a lot about choirs and I had the literature about choirs, and sometimes nothing helped because the level of skill the choir, the imaginary choir, had in that literature was something that was unattainable for me at that point. So I had to find a way how to work with a choir that is really objectively not sounding good. So I hope you find this video helpful. I hope that you take this video as really kind advice and not a criticism. It's just a fact of life. You can have even good singers or average singers, and when you connect them into a choir, when you connect them in a group that is singing, it's not always a good sound, and that's okay. And it will take time to improve, but you will improve, they will improve, and you have to have the patience and the serenity and the belief and the confidence in yourself as a choir director and in them as singers who will really try. And who knows, maybe you will never get to the point of being recognized as a really good sounding choir, but certainly you will improve and it will be something you did. So don't give up. Please don't give up. Okay, there is room for improvement. Okay, and that's it. That's the video. A controversial video. Thank you for being here. Thank you for asking the question how to work on this issue. If you want to talk to me, you can email me, you can find me on Facebook. If you wish to see more from Enquire to Acquire, you can subscribe, you can watch all of the other videos here, you can support it this way. Thank you for watching. Conduct well, conductors, and I'll see you next time. Bye!